Dubai, Thailand, Singapore, Mexico, Spain, Italy, Ghana, Portugal. All of these places that people dream about retiring to. They say, wow, that looks so amazing on social media. I want to retire there. And I want to retire early to these countries. But when they hit the ground, they realize that everything is not as it appears on social media. That retiring in these places is actually fraught with a lot of different issues if you are not considering some of the things that you should be considering before you go there. So on today's video, we want to talk about the 8 things that you should be considering before you choose to retire abroad. Hey guys, it's Aman
and Christina
from Our Rich Journey.
Okay, so in this video, we are ready to break down some of the things that you absolutely need to research and understand before you move abroad to a foreign country. Now, if you don't know our story, we live here in Lisbon, Portugal. We have been living in Portugal for almost 5 years. We reached financial independence before the age of 40 and we just retired. So we moved here in Portugal, but there were a lot of important things that we researched before we decided to move here from the Bay Area in California. So let's go over those 8 things right now.
The first thing, the number one thing, are the politics and laws for the country that you are considering. Now, I feel like people don't do enough research in this regard. They just kind of show up, but they don't understand that everything is not going to be the same that it was where they were coming from. Now, there are some things that you can be arrested and jailed for in some countries that are considered just rude habits in the US. So these laws and politics, and you know what? Let's talk about the politics first. Because most of the time when you're in a new country, you fail to realize what's going on politically because maybe it's in a different language. But the politics in a country can definitely affect you as an immigrant in that country. There are some countries that are anti-immigrant. They don't even want you there, but yet you think that this is just the most wonderful place. When behind the scenes, there are laws that are bubbling up that are gonna make it really hard for you to settle in that country.
So of course, if you move to a different country, it could have a completely different political ideology than what you are used to. So maybe the country is incredibly conservative and you are liberal, or maybe the country is incredibly liberal and you are conservative. These are things that you really need to understand because it can be very different from where you're coming from, and the adjustment can be very hard if it's not something that you're prepared for.
And I'll use Americans as an example. A lot of Americans like to talk about their constitutional rights. Well, some of those rights don't even exist in these countries that you are considering retiring to. So be careful applying what you're accustomed to as far as laws and politics to the new country that you are moving to. So a really good way to find out what's going on in that country politically is to watch or listen or read the political news. So you want to find these political outlets and identify what they are talking about.
Next are taxes. You really want to understand how you are going to be taxed if you move to a foreign country. You need to know how you're going to be taxed in that foreign country, but also how you'll continue to be taxed in your home country. Now, US citizens, for example, when they move abroad, they still have to file their taxes in the United States. No matter what, every single year they still have to file. Now, if you move to a foreign country, you may also have to file taxes in that foreign country. You have to understand if there are double taxation agreements between the United States. For example, if you're from the United States and the foreign country that you move to, what are those tax requirements? If there's not a double taxation agreement, what are your requirements for each country and what will you be paying in taxes?
Now, there are even some countries that will tax you even more as a foreigner for being in that country. For example, if you are trying to buy a house as a foreigner in a country, you may have to pay additional taxes just because you are a foreigner. So a good way to understand the taxes in a particular country is to talk to a tax consultant that is accustomed to working with people from your country. They will understand the ins and outs and the reciprocity agreements that your country and the country that you are immigrating to may have in place.
So the next thing you really want to understand is healthcare. What are the treatments available? How is the relationships with the doctors and patients? What is the level of care that would be provided to you in that foreign country? This is all really important to understand.
And I'll give you an example of something that really surprised us when we lived in Japan. The relationship that we had with our doctors in Japan was completely different from the relationships that we had with our doctors in the US. You know, the dialogue wasn't there. The back and forth wasn't there. There were doctors in Japan that said, this is what the situation is, and they weren't expecting you to question that. Now, of course, we would often ask a lot of questions, and it was something that they were surprised that we were doing.
And one other thing that's really important about healthcare is if you plan on going back and forth to your home country and your new country, it's really important to understand how your healthcare or how your health insurance will transfer from one place to another as well.
Now, in our case, here in Portugal, we have a private health insurance provider that actually provides insurance to us when we go back to the US, but only for a certain amount of time. And in cases where there is a health issue that is catastrophic, we must be making efforts to come back to Portugal. This is all a part of the health insurance that we have picked.
Next, you obviously want to understand the visa and residency requirements. When we moved to Portugal, we had actually a couple other countries that we were looking at, that we were interested in, and we just found that Portugal was so welcoming to foreigners. They made the residency and visa requirements very smooth. But if you're going to certain countries, it may not be very smooth. You really want to understand the process that is entailed with applying for residency in that country and making sure that you feel comfortable going through that process.
So Portugal was so easy for us that we did our application all by ourselves. Now, there are some countries where it is so difficult that you must hire a professional, and hiring that professional could be very costly. So that is an expense that you must take into consideration if you need help with your visa application. And it may be an expense that is a reoccurring expense because your residencies and visas may have to be renewed every so often. And this brings us to the next thing to consider are your actual expenses when living in that country. We think it's great that you create an estimate before you arrive, but realize that those are only estimates. And it's not until you live here that you realize the actual cost to live in that country. Now, when we first moved to Portugal, we actually made our estimate quite high. And we realized after living here that we could bring down a lot of the costs, especially when it came to food and entertainment. But there were other costs that we seriously underestimated, and that is the cost of housing and how that would increase over the period of time that we have been here in Portugal. When we first got here 5 years ago, it was very reasonable. You could find yourself a wonderful home for a reasonable price. Now, prices are outrageous. And so if you are looking at old numbers when it comes to housing, you may be in for a surprise when you actually move to that country.
Next, you want to think about how you envision your life abroad and whether those things that you want to do can be supported abroad. So a lot of times people love going to certain places because it's a great vacation destination. And sometimes they fall in love with the idea of moving there based off of their vacation experience. But once you move somewhere and you live there permanently, it's no longer a vacation. Things can change. Things may not have the same experience. So it's really important to understand all the details of what your day-to-day life will look like, how you want it to look like, and whether that can be supported in that foreign country.
And I think a prime example of this are the friends and the community that you want to have around you. When you're on vacation, you're just coming here with maybe a couple of your friends, maybe your family. But when you live here, those same people aren't going to be with you. You are starting from scratch in a lot of cases. So going to a place and envisioning yourself hanging out with the locals, hanging out with other immigrants and expats, what is that going to be like for you and your situation? Are you going to be playing paddle? Are you going to be in a wine club? Are you going to see yourself hanging out at the beach all the time with your friends, or maybe all by yourself? It's important that you understand what is real life going to be like for you on a daily basis when you wake up in the morning until you go to bed at night.
The next thing to consider is safety. Now, if you're looking at an entire country, you may want to be more specific in terms of the city that you want to live in or the neighborhood that you want to live in. Hone in on those things because the overall country could have one safety level, but if you're thinking about moving somewhere specific, that safety level could be very, very different. So it's really important to understand all of the different various factors that could impact safety where you are specifically planning to live.
The thing about safety is that a lot of countries don't publicize their safety or crime statistics maybe in a fashion that you can understand. Maybe it's in a different language or it's buried somewhere, so you don't really get a feel for how safe a country is from a statistical standpoint. And you may get a better feel by talking to locals or chatting with people in different Facebook groups, but still, even there are things that may be left out or that may be underemphasized or underrepresented. The safety aspect for us has always been one of those gray areas that is left up to interpretation based off of where you come from. And I'll give you guys a really quick story. You know, when you first come to Lisbon, there are a lot of places that have graffiti on it, really nice neighborhoods, but you will see walls or buildings that look abandoned and they will have graffiti all over them. Now, for someone that is coming from the US, we see graffiti and we think of that as being a very rough and tough neighborhood. But here in Portugal, it's actually a common thing. And some graffiti is artistic in many, many ways, but it doesn't represent that this neighborhood is a dangerous neighborhood just because there is graffiti on old buildings. The next and last thing to consider are the showstoppers for you. And these are the types of things that if you can't do them in that country, then you just cannot survive without it. And there are things like if you are into medical marijuana, if you like to carry a weapon in public, if you have a very strong stance on politics or vaccination requirements, if you love to protest in the streets, some countries may not be for you because they have zero tolerance for these types of things. And they may be something that you hadn't even considered thinking about until you got to that country and tried to pull it off.
So those are the 8 things that we think that you should really consider before you move abroad to a foreign location. If you have any other ideas of things people should consider, please leave a comment below so that we can all learn from each other. And of course, if you like this video, please give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and join the journey.